good, thank you. Right? You have signed in already?
No.
Oh, a sign in.
Oh, it's over there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's see. I wonder if this got his mic on.
Good morning, Plainview.
Good morning.
It's kind of neat. You know, you hear the feedback from that, and it's kind of like an echo. I'd say good morning, Plainview, and all of a sudden, good morning, Plainview, echoes back. Everybody doing okay out there? Good. No sickies?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's good to hear, too. Kind of getting on the lookout for that here. The numbers are going up again in Lubbock. Okay. Anybody got any questions about anything that we're doing that they're having a problem with, or quizzes or anything like that? Oh, greetings. If you're out in Plainview, she'd hammer you over the head for walking in the door. I'm a gentle person. I don't do things like that. You guys believe that stuff? Where did we leave off? We were talking about we talked about Plymouth. We hadn't talked about Massachusetts, or I said we were going to talk about it, or did we get into it?
You would start off with the preacher's daughter.
Talking about a preacher's daughter, okay. So we were in Massachusetts then, because that was Ann Hutchinson, and we can tell that story without turning the slides on, but I will eventually. We're still on the same PowerPoint. With a little bit of luck, maybe we'll get off of it today and move on to the next one. Let me see if I can find it. Hello?
Yeah, we left off the Ann Hutchinson.
Yeah. What am I looking for here that I can't find? Wars of Colonial Empire. There it is. It's way down there. Okay. English exploration in colonies. Okay, let's tell the story about Ann Hutchinson. Not in any great detail, but I want you to understand the significance of Ann. She was a preacher's daughter. I warned you to watch out for them. She probably knew more about the Bible than her daddy did. That's just how that works out. She thought that some of the things they were saying in their weekly or more than weekly church meetings were starting to slide away from what they'd said they were when they all agreed that they were Puritans that wanted to improve the church, like John Winthrop and all these people. And she could hold her own in an argument with the preacher because she was the preacher's daughter and she'd studied it. There was another thing going around about the same time, and I'll put the slide up with the word. There was another variation on Christianity. There were several others. One group were the Anabaptists. We won't talk about them. Then there was another group of people called the Antinomians. And we will talk about them really briefly. This is all floating around there. Antinomians had a belief that some people have had since then, in other sects of Christianity, if you want. They believed that the Bible was the word, but it wasn't the final word. And so they believed that people could have revelations from God after the Bible. And the Puritans and the Catholics and other established Christians believed that anyone that claimed that they'd had a conversation with God was guilty of heresy. Good example of that is Joan of Arc. You've probably all heard when you were little kids about Joan of Arc. She thought the angels were talking to her, and she was a great French general. Did great damage to the English when they were fighting, but eventually the church caught up with her and they burned her at the stake. So, antinomianism was viewed as a threat to the church. And there were a lot of people that were starting to think about that. The human mind thinks about things. Sometimes it's better if you think about it not to say it. I can think of any number of times when after the fact I wished that I hadn't said it and I just thought about it. When I was a little kid I did that, and I got my face slapped quite often by my beloved mother, who wouldn't put up with stuff. We talked about Roger Williams and his disagreements, such as being forced to go to church, not treating the Indians well. Anna Hutchinson started saying things like, you guys aren't being true to your faith. These are the leaders of the colony. They're all ministers. The colony was top-heavy with ministers. And people started coming by to visit her from time to time. And they'd sit around drinking whatever they drank. I don't think they had much tea, but maybe whatever they made that was ersatz tea. And just talking in general terms in a relaxed manner about where maybe the preachers were going wrong and other things. And the thing was, people enjoyed that conversation, and more people came to her house to talk, including men. Some women would drag their husbands along to listen to it. And before long, Anne Hutchinson becomes a threat to the leadership of the colony. And eventually, when they couldn't shut her up, just like they couldn't shut up Roger Williams, they're going to call her out and say, you're on trial for heresy. And they brought her before a tribunal made up of the leadership of the general court. They wouldn't let her, during the trial lasted just a few days. There's actually, I think, some transcripts of most of the conversations, but they wouldn't let her go home with her family at night. She had to stay. She was kind of being kept prisoner in somebody else's house, and they wore her down. You know, she was able to hold her own in a debate with somebody about the Bible, but after you've got 4 or 5 people interrogating her for 3 straight days, she got a little bit tired and a little bit careless about how she put things, and I think at some point she wanted to say, I felt a divine inspiration, and she said, God told me, which was heresy. And we got you now. And they're going to find her guilty of heresy, and they're going to kick her out of the colony with all 9 of her children. Well, they kicked her out, and the kids followed her. They're going to go down and join Roger Williams. Eventually they'll go up to what is now upstate New York. Finally, according to what people heard anyway, they were a strange group of Indians that they didn't know passed through and killed a number of members of the family, including Anne. So in a way, the banishment was a death sentence, although it was a much delayed death sentence. Why did they kick her out of the colony? Were they really worried about her talking about religion? Why did they kick her out of the colony? Anybody? Ladies, speak up. This is your chance. Why did they kick her out of the colony? What was she a threat to? Plainview, tell me.
I mean, if it's anything like the Bible,
Did,
women don't have.
did you do that?
I can't hear you.
Okay.
When the
Go
light
ahead and
comes
say it.
on, you
Can't
can say
hear
it.
you.
It's not coming on.
I can hear you from the front mic. Just speak up.
Okay. I said if it's anything like the Bible, women really didn't have a say-so in the Bible. Like, they don't have a place. It's, you are to be seen and not heard.
Well, I think my interpretation, I wasn't there, but I think the real reason that they kicked her out was she threatened their authority. And they viewed her as a threat to their authority. And what made it even worse, oh my God, it's a woman doing this. So I always make the argument that there's our first American feminist, Anne Hutchinson. I think when I put it in the exams and I ask that question, I say according to Mr. Hunt, just so that you realize that's my point of view. But I'll continue to teach that as long as I live, for the next week or so anyway. Massachusetts Bay exploded in population. Within 10 or 20 years, they've got 80,000 people there. They're going to grow so much that they absorb Plymouth. And they're going to claim a lot of territory up north, in territories that eventually became Maine and other places like that. They won't get to keep it, but they're going to claim it. And Anne Hutchinson wasn't the only one, and Roger Williams weren't the only ones kicked out. And Anne Hutchinson also might have been toying around with antinomianism. I don't see it clearly. Some others too. There was another minister by the name of Thomas Hooker, and they're going to kick him out for differing with them. And it's hard for me to emphasize enough that that was almost like a death sentence. Where are you going to go? Thomas Hooker went down in the direction of Roger Williams, the same as Anne Hutchinson did at the beginning. And he's going to go up to, let me see if I can find a map of it here. Yeah, here it is. Let me get it set up so you can see it. Come on, machine, please cooperate. There you go. Or you can look at it on your own slides on your computer. But basically, he's going to go over where that big red arrow is pointing in the big map, up on the Connecticut River. And this is Hartford, and eventually that whole area will become Connecticut. What's interesting is that in that particular time, and we'll look at the Dutch in a minute, the Dutch were also up in there, so they kind of overlapped up there, and there's going to be friction between the Dutch and the English colonists. Another fellow by the name of John Wheelwright is going to go up north. Let me see if I can find him on a map somewhere. Up in this area. And he's going to found his own little colony called Exeter. And eventually Exeter will be in New Hampshire. That's the seeds of New Hampshire. So you've got, in the people that were kind of dissidents from Massachusetts, you've got Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. They're spreading out for one reason or another. Some people are spreading out just because they need room to farm, but other people are being kicked out. And they're surviving. Initially, a lot of those people would die, but these people are surviving. And so you're getting really, really large growth. And you've got the population in that general area to allow that to happen. Because people will follow Hooker, and they'll follow Wheelwright, and they'll follow Roger Williams. And those different places are all going to apply for charters from whatever company's controlling the area at the time. And it will change. They'll change names when we don't worry about that. Let's look at the Dutch for a minute. Who was the Englishman that sailed up around where New York is now, looked at the rivers, looked at those islands in that area and all that, and claimed it for Holland? Can anybody remember? He was an Englishman. He did it in the early 1600s. What was his name? Anybody? Let's look at the map. These are the Dutch companies that control the colonies. First, the Dutch East India Company. Then the Dutch West Indies Company. They'll control that area. They're going to call it New Netherlands. You notice if you look at that arrow that points at the Connecticut River, there's also English settlers along that river. There's going to be a little friction there. But there's so few people for the area that they're covering that they don't necessarily have to run into each other. But they'll start competing, especially because a lot of them are buying fur from the Indians for income, and they'll start getting in fights about who gets to get what from what tribe and that sort of thing. Who was the guy that explored that? He had the river named after him. Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson. He claimed it on behalf of Holland. So that's New Netherlands. You understand the names, right? Netherlands is synonymous with Holland, and we call them the Dutch. Did I explain to you why they don't call themselves the Dutch? They know that we call them Dutch. Why don't Netherlandish people call themselves Dutch? It's because Dutch sounds like Deutsch. And what does Deutsch mean? Anybody? Nobody? Sprechen Sie Deutsch? 99 Fraulein. I'm trying to think of anything that... German. Deutsch is German. And from time to time, for centuries, the Dutch people have had reason not to like the Germans. I learned about that when I was a 13-year-old young kid chasing this really, really pretty student that lived with us. She was a Dutch girl. She was about 19. Wow. And I was just kind of getting interested in girls. And one day I did something stupid. I said something nice about Adolf Hitler. I thought it was neat, the helmets they were wearing or something, and I went Sieg Heil like that, and the next thing I know I'm picking myself up off the floor because she turned around and whacked me one. Just totally destroyed my world because I worshipped her. And it turns out that the Dutch didn't like the Germans very much, especially after the Second World War, and she sat down, she apologized for hitting me. She sat down and explained just what the Germans had done during the Second World War, and she was alive then. And then I understood that they didn't like being reminded about the Germans. They already didn't like the Germans. A lot of these Dutch people didn't like the Germans because it's really complicated, but I'll get into it just so you understand. The Germans, there wasn't a country called Germany really then. There were a lot of principalities, and it was all the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was ruled by members of the Habsburg family, the same family that also ruled in Spain for a few hundred years. And the people in Holland, number one, made more money because they were industrious traders, businessmen. And number two, a lot of them were Calvinists. And the Spanish king personally owned the Low Countries, where Holland is now. He inherited it from his grandmother. Go figure. A lady named Mary of Burgundy. Anyway, they tried to force Catholic Church on these people, and these people wanted to follow the teachings of John Calvin. And so for 80 years, they're going to be fighting against the Spanish king, who's a Habsburg, and the Holy Roman Empire, which contains the German-speaking countries, also Habsburg. So what the heck? We don't like them either. Sometimes they really like the English because they're all kind of Protestants together, but sometimes the English and them are in competition because of trade. The Dutch were very good. They had lots and lots of merchant ships. A lot of the cargo that went in and out of England went on Dutch ships rather than English ships. Now, if you did your reading for this past week, there's a thing about the Navigation Acts. That was how the British were going to enforce their closed system of trade. And when they passed the Navigation Acts, they cut the Dutch out. So it was a whole big thing about them losing all that business with not only England, but with the British colonies. And there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars because of that. In between times, sometimes they were allies. And of course, when Queen Elizabeth was alive, she was always slipping them money because they were causing trouble for Philip II of Spain, and that made her happy. And sometimes the Dutch would cozy up to the English because they needed sponsorship. But it was kind of a love-hate relationship. Sometimes you're friends, sometimes you're not. The reason I'm talking about that is that this big New Netherlands in 1660, and we'll talk about what happens to the kings of England, but they're gone for 10 years, roughly between 1650 and 1660. When they come back on the throne, they're going to crank down on that Dutch trade again, and they're going to go to war, and Charles II of England is going to allow his navy to go over and capture the New Netherlands. Dutch couldn't fight back. They didn't have a navy that was available over there. They're busy fighting the English over near England. He'll give that whole area as a personal colony to his younger brother, the Duke of York. And you'd never guess what they're going to call the place now, right? That's how it got that name. They'll take the New Netherlands, that will become New York as a region, and the city of New Amsterdam, they'll change to the city of New York. That will all happen in about 1664. And we'll get back and look at the influence of things going on in Europe, and you'll see that process. But that's just to understand why it's kind of interesting to look at the Dutch colonies. Why were they there? Fur trade was one thing. Another thing, the Dutch had some colonies that they'd taken away from the Spanish down in the Caribbean. And the problem was that the people that ran those colonies down there couldn't grow the kind of food they were used to because it was too tropical. And so the people up in this New Netherlands were producing supplies to send down to the Caribbean. The Dutch got along with the Indians pretty well. I mean, they really trusted some tribes, but the problem was they trusted them so much, and you find out this bad thing that you learn in the playground in school is if you make a friend, a really close friend with somebody, then all that person's enemies become your enemies. And when the Dutch had close relations with the Indians, when the Indians got in a war, all of a sudden, oops, we're in it too. And they had that problem several times. And then when the British took over, it just all changed. Now you realize that there are a lot of people left, and the colonists didn't disappear. They just became subjects of the British Crown. And there's a lot of places, if you go through New York City itself, there's a lot of parts of New York City that still have Dutch names. Or your other European names. And there's a lot of families, American families of Dutch extract, who are descended from those Dutch colonists. I can think of a few that you probably might recognize. The Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were both descended from the Dutch. I'm trying to think of some more. I'll probably think about them about 10 minutes after class. But anyway, that's the way my memory works. So that's the Dutch. Let's talk about another colony. We're gonna go through all of these, the major colonies. We won't talk about all the little ones. And the next one along the line is gonna be founded in, well, it's chartered in 1632. And this one's a proprietary colony. This is our first proprietary colony. New York will become a proprietary colony much later. And that'll be Maryland. And it's founded by the Calvert family. And the heads of the Calvert family, one after the other, are called Lord Baltimore. A little hint about where the name of that city came from. I bet they didn't know they were going to have a football team. At any rate, they were Catholics. But they'd served the crown. They'd served James I and Charles I. And they're going to get a charter from Charles II when the Stuarts are put back on the throne in 1660. They're going to go over and start this colony in about 1634. The first city will be St. Mary's City. Strangely enough, must be Catholics. How many times have I had to? How many Catholics in here? I'm not trying to discriminate against anybody because I'm one too. It won't help your grade. I'm just trying to think about how many times I've had to say Hail Marys. You know the old thing, say 5 Hail Marys, 10 Our Fathers, and repent. I'll probably get in real trouble after I die for that. Someone will be telling me about it. This is going to be kind of like a crossbreed from the northern regions and the southern regions. Usually we consider Maryland the northernmost of the southern colonies. To me, it's pretty far north. It will border Virginia. It'll border another colony that's going to come here in the future called Pennsylvania. Another new colony that will happen called Delaware. The Crown's selling off this land. They'll grow some tobacco like the Virginians, but also they've got a little bit more water in the middle of their colony, the Chesapeake Bay and all its tributaries. So they're going to also have other things. They'll get into doing things like making barrels. That doesn't sound like much, does it? Back then, just anything that could contain water or any fluid like that was very important, or something you could pack fish in to transport them over to Europe. Made ships, built some ships back in those days. Later on, that industry will move to somewhere else. When the slaves arrive, they'll have slaves, not as concentrated as they will in Virginia and further south. We'll talk about them some more. There's Maryland province. There's arguments all along about where the border of Maryland is and the border of Pennsylvania. One of the kings will finally have to come forward and settle the argument. Next colony I'll talk about, 1663, and that's the province, or what they call the Carolina. Then it was just one big blob of land. At that stage of the game, it was the southernmost colony. When Charles II, he's the son of Charles I. What happened to Charles I? Don't know yet? Okay, well, we'll talk about it in a while. He lost his head in a dispute with Parliament, literally speaking, not, you know. Charles II becomes king, but then he gets run out of England. He has to hide out in France. The King of France is his cousin, I think. I have to go back and look at that. So, in 1660, Parliament finally decides to bring the Stuarts back and put them on the throne. They were without a king for about 10 years. They call that an interregnum. When he comes back, he wants to say thank you to a bunch of people that supported him in Parliament to get him back. And what he does is he gives them this big giant hunk of land that they name after him. They call it the Carolinas. They named the first town there after him. It's called Charlestown. Of course, eventually it morphs into some pretty influential people will have to do with the design of how the colony is going to be settled, and they try and lay out streets in Charlestown in a scientific grid, kind of like Lubbock. Isn't Lubbock neat? You know, everything's north and south, east and west. You get all confused when you get a road that curves. Eastern people just don't understand that. You look at them and say, and you ask them, is it on the west side of the road or on the east side? And they say, how can you tell? All of our roads go north and south and east and west, so of course you can tell. But anyway, in this case, one of the people that helps draw the plans for this is a fellow named John Locke. And I'll talk a lot more about John Locke. He was very important. His philosophy, his political philosophy was very important to us when we wrote our Declaration of Independence, when we wrote our Constitution. He'll never come to the Americas, but he'll write some really important things that influence us. What else? The Carolinas grew tobacco, but the southern part started growing things a little bit more like, well, you could grow things in a few degrees closer to the equator. Maybe some sugar, probably not very much, maybe some rice. Eventually, in 1712, it's just going to become too large an area to govern, and they're going to split it into half, North and South Carolina. But at first they didn't exist that way. Another province we got to talk about is another proprietary province. You can flip a coin. Is Carolina a proprietary province or not? Because the king gave it to 9 people that were his supporters. They were called the 9, you might want to remember this, the 9 Lords Proprietor. That makes it sound like a proprietary colony, but I think the shape of the beast, the shape of the animal was a little bit more like a charter colony, even though you had these Lords Proprietor. Some of them never ever went to the Americas. They were just owners from abroad. The British did a lot of that. They had a lot of owners like that in Ireland, owned all the land in Ireland, but they lived in England. Okay, the next colony down the line will be Pennsylvania. Let's look at Pennsylvania. I'm going to look at my notes to see if there's anything in here that I don't have on slides that I want you to remember about it. May not have it in this set of notes. Don't worry about it. Pennsylvania will actually be founded in 1682. It's another proprietary colony. There's an admiral by the name of Sir William Penn, who's lent a lot of money to the crown, and he gets the territory of Pennsylvania in exchange for the money that the crown owes him. One of the reasons he wanted that territory was for his son, William Penn. William Penn had come into a new religion. It was a Christian religion, but they were a little bit different, and they seemed a little strange to people, and they weren't really popular, and the leader of that religion went over and looked around in America to see if there was some place where they could settle and be on their own, so they wouldn't be the odd man where they were. Everybody know who they are? We have a street in Lubbock named after them. I live near it. They're Quakers. And they were named, that's not what they call themselves. They don't call themselves the Quakers. The Quakers was a physical thing that happened during worship, in their worship, when they felt, I guess, they felt the presence of God in them, and they would move like that. And it, for your average churchgoer there, it kind of freaked them out a little bit. And so, whenever you're afraid of something, right, you don't like it. So they're going to settle there, starting in the 1680s. They're going to have some border disputes with territory that New York claims and territory that Maryland claims. But Pennsylvania is special in one way because the people that founded this, and it's going to kind of be run by a committee. The owner is William Penn, but it's going to be run by a committee of Quakers, and they're very, very tolerant people, and they believe in peace, and they don't believe in war, and they'll let anyone come to that colony that's a good citizen. They don't care what his religion is or anything. They have a lot of Jewish people coming from Spain, because life is a little bit uncomfortable, in fact, very uncomfortable for them there. And from other places in Europe, different groups that maybe aren't comfortable where they live. As long as they're good citizens, they're welcome. And they also get along with the Indians, probably better than any other English colony. I keep starting to say British, and it's not British, it's English. They get along with the indigenous people. And the indigenous people like them and tend to trust them. This is going to change eventually as we move down towards independence, because new people will be running Pennsylvania. For a long time, it's the elders of the Quakers that run the whole area. What do we have left? Let's go south. Let's go way down south. There was a big empty place in between Carolinas and Spanish territory, and the English were afraid, and the Carolinians were afraid, that the Spanish were gradually going to fill it up. And they didn't want that, so they're going to charter another colony, and this doesn't happen until the 1700s, 1732. It's interesting to note that when the Spanish colonized in places in North America, a lot of that colonization, they started all this in the 1500s. But that particular area in North America, also the West Coast, they didn't really start getting in there until the 1700s. They didn't bother. They weren't interested. They were busy. They were covering a huge area. But now the people in the Carolinas feel a threat from the Spanish, and the Crown feels a threat from them. They don't want, anyone kind of getting into the territory they want to claim. So they're going to set up this colony they're going to call Georgia, so you can guess who was king. Perhaps King George. It will be chartered by the Privy Council in the name of the king in 1632. Actually, that's not correct. It will be chartered by the Privy Council in the name of the king in 1732. That slide's wrong. You won't have 9 lords proprietor like you had in the Carolinas, but you'll have 21 trustees who are in charge of this whole area. And they will populate it. Contrary to what some people say, it's not a prison colony. They didn't dump the prisons out in there, but they will put people there that are fairly well educated but aren't doing so well in life. People who tend to be in debtor's prison or something like that. They'll put them over there, and the whole idea is to fill that void so the Spanish don't move into it. They have some interesting ideas at the beginning. They're not going to have any slavery there. Mr. Hunt, I think Georgia had slaves. Oh, yeah. But the idea at the outstart was no slaves. They were also not going to have any hard liquor there. Yeah. There's a problem with that. One of the problems was that when they started getting people to come and join their colony, some of them came from the British-owned islands in the Caribbean and places like Bermuda. And these people were already established, already had slaves, already had their booze, the whole 9 yards. They're going to bring that with them. So the idea of no slavery is going to kind of fizzle away. And the idea of no booze is going to fizzle away even faster. They're going to make their living on some, maybe they grew some tobacco, but probably not much because they're a little bit too far south. They'll grow some rice. They'll grow some sugar way down at the bottom of Georgia. Timber. They trade with the Indians a lot, whatever they get from them. They have some interesting things like deposits of clay that you can make expensive pottery with, or expensive, tableware with. And another little thing they do is, since they're way down at the southern end and nobody's paying attention to them, they can slip down into the Caribbean and buy stuff from the Spanish colonies, which was a big no-no according to the rules of the mercantile system. But the truth be known, all of the colonies, all the way up to Boston, would send ships down to the Caribbean and buy sugar. And if they couldn't get sugar, they'd take molasses, which is the raw crushing of the sugar cane. Why would they take molasses? What's molasses good for? Anybody? Well, before people were using maple syrup, that was a sweetener. In fact, back in the good old days, maybe even in my lifetime, some people were still using it to mix with stuff like sulfur. They make you take sulfur and molasses, if you got sick. Yeah, nothing can make sulfur taste good. But there was a much more important commercial thing that they did with molasses. Connected with the Royal Navy. That's a good riddle. What can you do with molasses that the Royal Navy wants? In the Royal Navy, if you're on a warship, life was miserable. At best. When the weather was nice and everything else, it was still miserable. The captains were like little kings. They could do anything to you they wanted. When you slept in a hammock. And it was strung, like 5 or 6 high, well, depending on how high the decks were, one over the other. Can you imagine swinging back and forth in this hammock with somebody's butt right over your head? Right? You can start thinking about that. We don't have to get too graphic. They worked hard hours. When they got in fights, usually people died because of splinters rather than anything else, because wood splinters when a cannonball hits it. They had to do something to make life a little bit better, and nobody could stand it. So what did they do every day? Every day, every sailor on the ship, officer, enlisted, everybody got a ration of rum. And you make rum out of molasses. And boy, oh boy, if you had barrels of rum, you could make big money, because the British Navy was always buying. And so as far north as Boston, they were doing it. Philadelphia, they were doing it. Philadelphia got a lot of sugar from the Caribbean. And Georgia, of course, could do it because they were pretty close to those people down south. Here's this province or colony that's not supposed to have any alcohol in it, right? And they're neck deep in it. One other thing they had in their plan was, we're not going to let people get giant farms the way that happened in Virginia, where a few families tended to own everything. The Randolphs and the Macons and the Birds. I mean, they still own a lot to this very day. I mean, we've had several senators named Byrd. Randolph in the American Revolution was a big name. They didn't want that to happen in Georgia, so they said there's a limit on anybody's land holdings to 50 acres. I'm sure they broke that rule pretty soon, too. Okay, that's the southernmost. I've got to mention this fellow because in your little golden book of history they'll mention him. I don't want to leave you out of that. This was the earliest governor of Georgia, James Oglethorpe, General Sir James Oglethorpe. A lot of people hated his guts because he was fairly strict. He exercised his authority pretty strongly. On the other hand, Georgia was attacked a number of times, and Oglethorpe defeated the Spanish, chased the Spanish away a number of times. So he served the colony well. A lot of people blamed him every time they lost a battle with the Spanish, but he did the best with what he had that he could do. Okay, let's talk about the indigeni for a while. What are indigeni? That's the plural for indigenous, what? Who are the indigenous people? Anybody? Come on, somebody help this classroom out. This classroom's a little slow, Plainview. Somebody answer. What are indigenous people?
Native Americans.
The natives. You don't even have to say Native Americans, just the natives, the people who are already there. Absolutely right. Gold star is in the mail to Plainview. That's all relative, right? The newest guy to get there calls everybody else indigenous. Let's talk about, you can tell me, what was the first, there was one Indian confederation that the people came in contact with in Virginia. What was their name? What did they call them? They named one guy after it, but that wasn't really his name. Come on, you've all seen Disney, so who was it? The Confederation. It's called the Powhatans. And of course, it was a love-hate relationship. Wahum Seneca, the leader, more or less leader of the Powhatans, tended to want to help the early colonists off. But different groups of the Indians in this confederation would get in fights with different colonists for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of times it was the colonists' fault. His younger cousin or brother, whatever he was, whatever the relationship was, Opakano thought we need to kill all the colonists and just get rid of the problem. Probably a good idea, except they didn't get it done. So they fight these wars they call the Powhatan Wars. There's several of them because of Opakano, but usually Powhatan was able to keep a lid on it until he died in 1618. After that, Opakano was a lot more influential than anyone else. So they fought a second Powhatan War in 1622, and then the Virginia colony was made into a royal colony, had a little bit more control. That was in the South. How about in the North? Who did the people that went to Plymouth meet? What Indian tribes did the Plymouth people going to Plymouth meet? Can you remember? Their leader was Massasoit. Say it if you feel inclined to. You're looking at me like you're about to say it. No? Okay. So you can't hide behind that mask. Or your shirt. Somebody? Nobody? The Wampanoags. Massasoit was the leader of the Wampanoags. There were a lot of tribes up in that area. They bumped into, probably the strongest one was the Wampanoags. Remember I said the guy Squanto wasn't actually a Wampanoag. There he is. He was a Patuxent or a Nauset, depending on who you believe. His tribe was extinct, so he lived with the Wampanoags. He's the guy that could speak good English because he'd been to Europe. Go figure. I just marvel at that. He was a kid, he's standing on the shoreline, some Spanish ship sailed by, they grabbed him. Hey, here's a good specimen, stuck him on the ship. Took him back to Europe. He made his way through, he must have learned Spanish, probably learned French and English too. I know he learned English. He made his way through Europe until he found a place that had ships that were going to America, got on one of those ships and went back. When he got home, he found out nobody he knew was still alive. So he joined in with the Wampanoags, and he was a savior for the Pilgrims. Eventually, he's going to get kicked out of the Wampanoag family because they think he's starting to behave more like he's a white man than he's an Indian. We went through this before, right? We talked about people that are more like another people than their own people. Did we? No? Come on, you got a good word for it. Like, what do African Americans call an African American that starts acting like he's a white guy? Or cozies up to the white people? There's a slang expression. You've never heard it? Black on the outside, white on the inside? Oreo. He's an Oreo. And what do Asian people I know the Vietnamese do it, and I think the Japanese do it too. What do they call one of their people who's more like an American than like one of them, can't speak their language or anything, even though their face looks like them? A banana. Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. Goes on and on and on. You can find, I've never found one in Mexico. I've been waiting to find it. I know in Japan, for example, Japanese people really don't like a Japanese ethnic person who can't speak Japanese. Vietnam, they're more give and take to the Vietnamese. But we lived in Japan, and my wife was Vietnamese, but if she changed her hairstyle and her clothing, some Japanese people might think she was Japanese. And I was always really careful. My wife always got angry when I did this. If we were doing business or negotiating with someone, and somewhere along the line I would always let drop that my wife's Vietnamese. And she'd say, "Why do you have to do that? Why do you have to do that?" And I said, "Because they don't like Japanese people who can't speak Japanese. So let's just get the story straight right up. Now maybe they'll talk to us." Yeah, people are like that wherever you go. I mean, I'd say it was evil, but it's kind of just natural that people feel a little bit uncomfortable about that sort of thing. I mean, I know that some people in Mexico consider La Malinche, otherwise known as Dona Marina, as a traitor, because she helped Cortez get to the Aztecs. And they started saying, "You're more white than one of us." In the case of Squanto, the Wampanoags kicked him out, and the colonists had to save him eventually. But as long as Massasoit was alive and William Bradford were alive, they didn't have major conflicts. After they died, they started having conflicts, and it was all about, well, let me give you a list of things here. I think I've got some of the issues. Trampling native cornfields by livestock that was owned by the colonists, increased competition for resources, land for planting, places to hunt and fish. The fur trade went dead. Why? Why did the fur trade go dead in New England? Because they killed it all off. So that caused hard feelings. And then funny things like Plymouth Colony thought that the Wampanoags belonged to them. And they got really mad when the Wampanoags did business with the people from Massachusetts, or if they did business with the Dutch people, a little bit to the south. Then the Wampanoags said, "Where did you get, ownership of our tribe?" So there was this friction. Normally it was managed, but every once in a while something would break out. There was one fight between the Pequots, who were one of those tribes up around where Connecticut is now. And they get into it with some of the white settlers. They said that a Pequot killed a white settler, so they went in and found a Pequot village and killed everybody in it in revenge. Pequots are going to organize themselves and attack the white people. It's war, 1636. Some of the Indian tribes sided with the colonists. Some of them sided with the Pequots. At the end of it all, about 1,500 Pequots were killed. That was a major portion of their tribe. And the Pequot tribe was more or less wiped out as a tribe. There were individuals left. Some of them were enslaved, sent out to the Bermuda and places like that to be slaves, because they could never get away with making them slaves in the Americas. And some of them just found other places to go and live. Here's the attitudes. You need to hear those. Minister Cotton Mather, famous in the history of the American colonies. Cotton Mather described the slaughter of the Pequot as a, quote, sweet sacrifice. And another minister, one of his colleagues, said, get this one, "Sometimes the scripture declareth, women and children must perish with their parents." I haven't been able to find that anywhere in the Bible. Maybe that's why some people don't like all the ministers. Roger Williams, on the other hand, said, we're getting so land hungry, we're as land hungry as the Spanish were gold hungry, and look what happened to them. They had problems. And we're going to have problems. Not too long after that, this is in the 1630s, you're going to have another war. It's called King Philip's War. William Bradford's dead, Massasoit's dead. Europeans tried to transpose their not just their belief, but their culture on the Indians. So, for example, they didn't understand women making the decisions for some of the Indian tribes and things like that. So they're always talking to the man, and they kind of forced the Indians to do that too, just so they could get along. They tried to turn them all into Christians, and some of them went along with that, and some didn't. And they didn't understand consensuous government, a government where a bunch of guys just get together and they come to just a general agreement, and if you don't agree, you don't have to go along with it, that sort of thing. They believed in authority, governmental authority. And so they didn't talk about the Sachem or the most influential man in the tribe. They talked about the king of the tribe, because Europeans had kings. Massasoit's dead. His son is called Wamsuta. Wamsuta is going to die in unfortunate circumstances. The colonists gave him an English name. They called him Alexander. But all this connection that they had with Wampanoag starts to go sour. And we're going to have King Philip's War. Wamsuta dies while he's visiting the government of Plymouth Colony. Actually dies when he's being confined by them. That really irritates him, and his brother, his name Metacomet, will take over control or leadership, can't say control, of the Wampanoags, and he's not very happy. That's going to break relations with the Plymouth colonists, because the Wampanoags were the main tribe that was related to them, and he's eventually going to call everyone to go to war. In this case, still not all of the Indians take the Indian side of the war, but most of them do. And it's going to be a bloody, nasty war. It's going to be the worst war, proportionately speaking. What proportion of the colony is actually killed is as bad as the Civil War. Of course, it's fewer people because there were fewer people there. It's going to wipe out any organized tribe in New England. They're just all gone. Either they're gone or they get smart and go somewhere else. And it's going to wipe out a major portion of one generation of colonists, young men and women, as far as that goes. When they got to killing, they killed everybody. It's going to take the colony a while to recover from that. Not that long, but it'll take them a while. It'll take them a couple decades. They called it King Philip's War because they took Metacomet's name, and you got to have a Christian name so we can talk to you. And they made him King Philip, which is an unfortunate name because that's the name of kings of Spain. The English didn't like kings of Spain. Anyway, that's the big major war. Now, one other thing I want to talk about, and we're doing pretty well. We're making some good progress here. There is another war that involves Indians, and this is in Virginia. It's much later than the fighting with the Powhatans. We're pretty much all gone. In the 1640s, remember they're a royal colony ever since 1624. In the 1640s, there will be a governor named William Berkeley. They're going to have another attack. Opequonno's not dead yet. He's going to attack again. There's not that many Europeans compared to, say, Plymouth and Massachusetts, but there's 15,000. The Algonquian, overall Algonquian population has gone down from about 24,000 down to 2,000. That's how badly disease and war has treated them. There's a dispute between a planter and a Doug Indian up on the Potomac River. That's pretty far north for that territory. It's way north of where Jamestown and Williamsburg were. A planter's going to get killed, and some other planters out there are going to retaliate by finding the closest Indian village and wiping it out. Killing about 3 or 4 chiefs, 5 chiefs it says on this thing, way up north of where they usually hang out. What's this all about? What this is all about is a lot of these guys are the indentured servants whose indentures have expired, and now they're trying to strike out on their own and have their own land, but the rich guys have got all the good land in towards the center of the colony, so they're going out on the periphery, which irritates the Indians because they're expanding. And the funny thing is, the real enemies in this aren't the colonists and the Indians, although the Indians are victims. The real enmity that breaks out is between the established planters, the Randolphs and the Macons and the Byrds and those people, and the royal governor, who of course is their big buddy, and the newcomers who want to expand. And the governor says, leave the Indians alone, you're causing trouble. And these people say, wait a minute, it's our turn to have farms and all that. That was the promise when we came over here. And the governor threatens, you know, I'm going to do something, I'm going to take action against you. And a young guy, he wasn't a poor guy by any means, but he wasn't wealthy, named Nathaniel Bacon, is going to organize a bunch of these frontiersmen, and they're going to teach Governor Berkeley who's who. I mean, they're going to send him in, he has to run for a British ship. He's going to go hide out on a ship, and they're going to burn Jamestown to the ground. Now, eventually the English get organized and get reinforced and all that, and they're going to start hunting down all these rebels. Some of them are hiding out in the swamp. Nathaniel Bacon, the leader of this group, dies of swamp fever or something out there, so they can't catch him. But they do catch a number of them, and they bring them back to the capital city, the ruins of Jamestown, and the governor says to Nathaniel Bacon, second in command, boy, am I glad to see you. I can't remember the exact quote. Don't know if I have it. It's a good quote. Where is it? I don't have it on here. Anyway, he said something like, I'm very happy to make your acquaintance. You will be hanged in 30 minutes. And he did. A lot of the members of that rebellion were hanged. And they felt, the people in the colony, a lot of them felt, well, they had it coming. But when word gets back to England about his draconian measures against them, the governor will be fired and replaced. Doesn't mean that there's not authority there, it'd just be a new guy. Bacon's rebellion then is really a war about land, and it's really between members of the colony. The Indians happen to be there and they're going to suffer from it. It's like the Vietnam War. Who was fighting in the Vietnam War? What was the war about? Next semester you can tell your professor, if you don't have me, you can tell him this, because he won't believe you. Who is fighting? You know, Americans are the guys that say, you know, if you want it done well, do it yourself. So we got involved in it directly. But who is the real enemy in this? It was the Soviet Union. We were fighting surrogates of the Soviet Union. When the war's over, the Soviet Union went broke. And in 1992, the Soviet Union dissolved. It doesn't exist anymore as a result of the Vietnam War and the Afghanistan War. And the poor Vietnamese people were kind of like those Indians. They were victims of the whole thing. It was two giant countries fighting each other in a kind of a strange way. That was the Cold War. And you never actually got nose to nose. You let other people, pushed other people in front of you. At any rate, there's an example of that right there, Bacon's Rebellion. All over land. Land is a very important thing, then and now. Everyone has land in their psyche. You can deny it. You say, I don't worry about land, Mr. Hunt. Everybody wants their own place, their own piece of the pie, right? And it's all about that four-letter word, land. And everyone's always interested in land price. Oh man, have land prices gone up here? You know, we're always worried about that because everybody wants their piece of the action. Okay, one other thing. We can do what I need to do on it, and that's the Atlantic slave trade. There was a euphemism for this. The euphemism for this, you know what a euphemism is, right? You should learn that word, E-U-P-H-E-M-I-S-M. A euphemism is like, what do you say? If you have the call of nature, then that's a euphemism in and of itself. You're sitting with your friends at the table at Cujo's or something, and you got to go to the potty. Do you tell them what you're going to go do? What do you say? I'm going to go powder my nose or commune with nature or whatever. Right? You don't say it. That's a euphemism. If someone dies, usually don't say he died. You say he passed away. He went to his just rewards or whatever. You don't like to say he died. That's a euphemism. The euphemism that they commonly used for slavery was the peculiar institution. There it is, the development of the peculiar institution. What we're talking about isn't slavery in general here. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And when the American colonies are founded, the first slaves show up there in 1619. We don't have a whole lot of slaves right at the beginning. I may have numbers here. There you go. By 1650, we've got a sum total of 1,600 slaves altogether in the North and South. Notice there's a few more in the North. That's just because the major seaports are up there. By 1710, there's going to be more in the South, and it's going to grow in the South and drop in the North, proportionately speaking. When the first slaves showed up in the colonies, Englishmen didn't have slaves. They didn't know what to do with them. These African people came off a Dutch ship. Here, I'll sell these people to you cheap. They really needed labor. What was their labor at the beginning? Indentured servants. It's really getting hard to get indentured servants because now the word's out what life's like as an indentured servant, and nobody's willing to volunteer anymore. There's a lot of argument about how many slaves crossed the Atlantic and came to the Americas. There's no argument that the majority of them came to South and Central America. Now, some of them from that point made their way up to North America. I think the most estimate is around 11 million, maybe a little bit more than that. There are people that spent their entire, historians who've spent their entire career figuring out ways to determine how many slaves came over. And then somebody else comes along after them and shoots down their whole theory. So the argument goes on. I'd say about 4% of all the slaves made their way to the Americas, to North America. It's still a lot of slaves. Initially they came from the eastern regions of Africa, the western regions of Africa, from the Bight of Africa, that kind of armpit-shaped thing there, a little bit north of that, from along the Congo River, from what is now the area that's now called Angola. As it gets harder to get slaves, they start coming from the eastern coast of Africa. Who made them slaves? Their fellow Africans made them slaves and then sold them. there's a lot of discussion about what good slavery was and bad slavery. Slavery is slavery as far as I'm concerned. But it's true that life was much more harsh on the plantations in the Caribbean than it was in other places where the climate was more temperate. That's just a matter of weather and treatment. And you can look at these figures that are on this chart and kind of guess whether they're accurate or not. There's no real way to know it. The biggest slave trading place probably, and I guess there were several, but I think the biggest market was Charleston, South Carolina. But they were being sold up north. And the people that did a lot of the slave trade, the people that shipped the slaves over the boats, a lot of them were from Rhode Island. A disproportionate number of them were from Rhode Island. And I always, when someone from up north saying, "Oh, we didn't have slaves, you know, we were superior to you," I point out that, yeah, but you made a lot of money off of them. One of the things about slavery, we talked about it briefly, that the rationale for being able to make someone a slave was they were pagans. They weren't Christians. And I said that sooner or later that argument was going to kind of fizzle away because eventually these people would become Christians. Then you have to think up another reason. Or do you have to let them go? The Southerners were already deeply dependent on slaves. There's some charts of slave ships. They were layered in there. They'd put one layer of slaves in there, sitting or lying down, and then they'd put planks over them and put another layer and another layer. And the early ships lost maybe as much as 50% of their cargo of slaves on the way over. Sharks would follow the ships because they'd throw bodies overboard. Later on, they figured out if they gave them more air, then more of them would survive. And they started being a little bit better. It wasn't out of humanity, it was out of trying to protect their cargo, which was worth a lot of money. And of course, a lot of people that were involved in it were human beings, and after one or two rides on the slave ship, they didn't want anything to do with it. It made them sick. Even the ones that owned the slaves. And so that's where a lot of the reformers, the English reformers came, were retired ship's captains and people like that. They couldn't stand it. But the slave trade, and we'll talk about influence of foreign wars and all that in a while, the slave trade built entire cities in England. Liverpool, the home of the Beatles, built with slave trade money. Bristol, major English seaport, built with slave trade money. Changes the whole makeup of the British countryside because of all this money flowing in. African kings depended on the slave trade for their living. And when the slave trade died in the 1830s, their economies were shot. They were in big trouble because no more income, at least from Europe. Slave laws. We're litigious people. We like to sue each other. And boy, oh boy, do we like law to tell us what we should do. You know, why think for yourself? Let's have a law about it. And we're arguing about it right now, right? The latest on and off, latest arguments, abortion rights, and things like that. Besides that, laws about voting. We're always arguing about it. The first law was to make up for a problem. And the problem was, okay, a slave is a slave. Eventually they'll convert them into property instead of being people. What happens if a white person has a child with a black person? What's that baby? They tried to solve that problem by saying Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. In other words, a Negro woman's child is a slave too. What's wrong with that? I mean, other than the whole slave thing. What's logically wrong with that? Come on, girls, speak up.
They have a dad. It's 50%.
Their dad's white, but what are they not talking about? They're talking about when the man is the father and the woman is the mother, and it's a black woman's the mother, and a white man's the father, what did they not mention? What happens if the mother's a white woman and the father's a black man? They don't even mention it. Oh, not to be talked about. It never happens. No white woman would ever do that. They did it all the time. They just kind of, we won't talk about that. People are people, human beings. Human animals have certain urges, and things happen. If you haven't already figured that out, and probably some of you have to your unhappiness, it happens. But they make this slave law, and then they make another one. What happens if they get baptized? Goodness gracious me, I have to let them go. So I pass another law in the 1667, an act declaring that baptism of slaves does not exempt them from bondage. Oh, now the law says it's okay, so we can keep them. We don't have to let them go. So much for the Pope. Still, it's a problem because every once in a while you get one of these slaves that complains, wants to sue his owner or something, goes to court. We'll fix that. 1705. Act declaring that the Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion are real estate. They're not people. Which means they have no standing in court. They can't testify in court. They can't be represented in court because they're property. Which means you can do anything you want to your property, can't you? Cows are your property. You can shoot them. Just think about, you can think about all sorts of bad things related to this point of view. This happened as people became more and more, the people that owned land became more and more dependent on slaves. To the point where slave populations in some counties was way bigger than white population. And people say, and I don't know if I have anything on it in here, yeah, people say, well, if they outnumber the white guys, why didn't they just go up and beat them up and leave? First of all, when slaves arrived in America, they came from all over. And most of them couldn't speak a common language. Most of them didn't worship the same gods or